I'm Astrid Lansing, 51, and I'm a Vice Admiral in the United States Navy and the first woman to direct the Defense Intelligence Agency. For 30 years, I let the people who were supposed to be proudest of me call my career embassy paperwork. But when 2 Navy SEALs blocked me from the principal entrance of a black tie reception, and my own brother laughed behind me, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed your whole life by the people who were supposed to know you best? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand in a room and let your work speak for you when no one in your family would, hit that like button and subscribe. It was the summer of 1980, and my father had just come home from a 6-month deployment. I was 5 years old. The kitchen in our Annapolis house smelled like coffee and aftershave because he was sitting at the table in his faded dungarees, and my mother had finally stopped crying. He lifted me onto his knee and turned me toward the shelf above the stove. There was a framed photograph there of a man in a different uniform, a man I had never met, my grandfather, a destroyer captain in the Second World War. My father pointed at the photograph and said, in a voice that was already teaching me to listen for the things he did not say, he was an officer. Officers don't see the work, they sign the paper. The work happens below. I did not understand what he meant. I just heard the difference in his voice when he talked about the wardroom and when he talked about the deck plate. He said the 2 words like one of them was something you ate at dinner and the other was something you wiped off your shoe. My mother stood at the counter drying a plate. She did not say anything. She rarely did when my father was talking about the Navy. That was the first lesson I ever learned in our house. There were 2 halves of a ship, and our family lived in one of them. The Annapolis house was a narrow 2-story on a side street, 6 blocks from the Severn River. My father had bought it in 1972 on a senior chief's pay, in cash, after his 6th deployment, and he had repaired the porch himself the summer my mother was pregnant with me. The kitchen had a row of nails along the wall above the sink where he hung his ball caps from every command he had served on. Dark blue caps with gold lettering and the names of destroyers and tenders. There were 11 caps. He could tell you the hull number and the home port and the captain's name for every one of them without looking. When he talked about those ships, his voice softened the same way it had softened when he had pointed at the photograph on the shelf and called my grandfather an officer. It was the only softness in his voice I ever heard, and it was reserved for the deck plate. By the time I was 14, the lesson had a shape. My father hosted a backyard cookout in the summer of 1989, and 3 of his chiefs came over with their wives. They drank beer at the picnic table and talked over each other about a new executive officer at Norfolk who was apparently making everyone miserable. I asked one of the chiefs what an executive officer actually did. He laughed. He told me to ask my father. My father looked at me across the picnic table, set his beer down, and said, evenly, "Officers don't know the deck plate, Astrid. We don't produce officers in this family." My younger brother, Tobias, 11 years old, laughed because the men were laughing. I took my plate inside and ate the rest of my hamburger standing at the kitchen sink. I never asked another question about the Navy at our table again. I just listened. In the spring of 1993, 2 months before my 18th birthday, my high school guidance counselor pushed a Naval Academy application across her desk. She told me the academy would be lucky to have me. I took the application home in my backpack and did not mention it at dinner. I filled it out in my bedroom over 3 weeks at night with the door closed. I wrote the essays about leadership and service the way you write essays about a place you have only seen in photographs. I mailed the application from the Annapolis post office on a Tuesday morning before homeroom. I did not tell anyone. When the acceptance letter came in late April, I read it 3 times standing in the driveway, then walked it into the kitchen and put it on the table next to my father's placemat. He read it once. He set it down. He looked at me. He said, "You picked the wrong door, Astrid. The work isn't up there." My mother wiped the counter and did not look up. Tobias, 15 years old, took the letter and read it through twice without speaking. He did not congratulate me either, but at least he read it. That was the first night I lay in my bed and made a decision about the rest of my life. I decided I would not stop pursuing the wardroom because my father did not want me in it. I decided I would also not spend the next 30 years trying to drag him in after me. I lay in the dark and made a promise to myself that I would learn to do this on my own. I did not know yet how long a loan takes when you are an officer in a family that does not produce them. Induction day was July 6, 1993. My father drove me down to Annapolis from the house in the truck. He had not said much since the letter, but he had not refused to drive me either, and at that point in our relationship, I considered the silent ride down to be a kind of acceptance. We parked by the seawall, and he walked me along the water before the formal induction ceremony. The yard patrol craft were tied up at the basin. The midshipmen were milling in their new plebe uniforms. My father stopped at the rail and said, looking out at the water, "You can still come home tonight. There's a hospital corpsman pipeline in Norfolk. You'd be a chief by 30. He said it without anger. He said it like he was offering me a glass of water on a hot day. I did not answer. I watched a yard patrol craft come in past the breakwater. I turned and walked back toward the formation. I heard him follow me eventually, somewhere behind me on the brick path. The commissioning ceremony was 4 years later, in May of 1997. I was 22 years old. I had earned my ensign's bars and a naval intelligence selection. My father wore slacks and a sport coat. He shook my hand after the ceremony. He did not say congratulations. He said, "Now we find out what kind of sailor you are." At the family dinner that night, at a seafood restaurant on the harbor, my father did not speak through the meal except to order. Tobias, 19 years old and a brand new seaman recruit at Great Lakes, asked one question about the curriculum, and my father shushed him before he finished the sentence. My mother cried into her napkin once. I paid for the meal with my first officer's paycheck. I drove back to the bachelor officer quarters that night in my navy whites, with my hands tight on the wheel, and I told myself quietly into the dark of the car that one day my father would say the word, "Congratulations." I told myself I just had to keep going. I did not know yet that he never would. That fall, I reported to the Naval Intelligence Schoolhouse at Dam Neck in Virginia. The schoolhouse was a low brick building in a fenced compound, and on the first morning of orientation, a senior Navy captain with iron gray hair and a green leather notebook tucked under his arm walked into the auditorium and introduced himself as Harlan Pierce. He told us he was there to talk to us for 1 hour about what naval intelligence actually does. He spoke without notes. He spoke without raising his voice. He told us about ships our families would never hear about, and operations our families would never read about, and people whose lives we would help save and never meet. And then he said the sentence I would carry with me for 29 years. He said, "If you do this job right, your family will think you push paper for the rest of your life. That is the cost. Decide now whether you can pay it." I wrote the sentence in my green notebook in pencil. I underlined it twice. I closed the notebook. I have kept it in the bottom drawer of every desk I have ever owned. I still have it. I still read it. I did not understand on that Tuesday in 1997 what he was actually asking me to agree to. I thought I did. I was 22. I thought I understood the cost the same way you understand the cost of a thing when you have not yet paid it. The cost is not what you pay on the first day. The cost is what you pay on the 10,000th day, when your father is dying in a hospital in Annapolis, and his last conversation with you is not about you. The cost is what you pay at Thanksgiving in 2001, when you have been back from a classified Middle East deployment for 2 months, and your father asks you across the turkey what you have been working on, and you have to tell him honestly that you cannot say. And he looks at your mother and your brother and says, probably typing up someone else's report, and the table laughs. I did not look up. I ate my turkey. I did not look up. I went home that night to my apartment in Norfolk and stood in the kitchen for a long time in my coat. I thought about Harlan Pierce and the green notebook. I thought about my father at the picnic table in 1989. I thought about the destroyer captain on the kitchen shelf, who had been a stranger to me my whole life, and who was apparently still a stranger to my father, too. I thought, I have signed up to be a stranger in my own family, Harlan Pierce told me on day 1. I just did not know what the word stranger weighed. I married a Navy aviator named Brent in August of 2003. He was a lieutenant commander I had met at a joint exercise off Mayport. He was kind, he was uncomplicated. He flew jets, which my father respected, and he did not push me to talk about my work, which I respected. The wedding was small, at the Academy Chapel, on a Saturday. My father wore slacks instead of a suit. He gave a short toast that mentioned Brent's flight hours and did not mention me at all. Tobias, 25 years old, and a petty officer second class made a sarcastic comment in the receiving line about how I would finally get my hands on a real Navy man. He said it with a smile. I laughed because I did not know what else to do. I was 28. The marriage would last 5 years. I would be in Bahrain for 19 of the 60 months it would last. I would not be home for either of Brent's near deployments. The marriage would end in a Norfolk apartment in 2008, with both of us being kind to each other about the fact that we had simply not been in the same building enough. In the summer of 2011, I was 36 years old and a lieutenant commander, and I was the intelligence lead on a small interagency team for an operation I'm not authorized to describe in any setting that includes you. The operation took 6 months to build. It ran in the early hours of a morning I do not say out loud. It worked. 6 weeks later, in a secure room at Naval Special Warfare Command, a Navy SEAL captain whose call sign I will never forget shook my hand and said the sentence I had been waiting 20 years for someone to say to me. He said, "Ma'am, our team came home because of your work." He filed the citation. I filed the citation. I told no one in my family. Harlan Pierce told us on day one what the cost was. I did not know until that handshake in 2011 that he had been telling the truth. The cost was specific. It was not romantic. It was not a movie. The cost was that on the morning of the operation, I was sitting in a windowless room in a building I cannot name, drinking coffee that had been brewed at 4 a.m, watching a screen with my hands flat on the table to keep them from shaking. And the moment the team called clear, I could not call anyone in my family to tell them I had spent the previous 6 months building the picture that had just gotten 31 Americans home. I could not call my mother. I could not call my father. I could not call my brother. I drove back to my apartment in Norfolk at 5 a.m, and I stood in my kitchen in my coat, and I poured a glass of water, and I drank it standing up, and the rest of the country woke up and ate cereal and went to work, and not one person in my life outside that windowless room knew that the day was different. That was the cost. Harlan had told me on a Tuesday in 1997, and I had written it in the green notebook, and I had not known what the sentence weighed until that morning in Norfolk, with the glass of water. I did not tell Brent either. Brent was the one I could have told the most about, in the unclassified shape of it, and I did not. He was an aviator. He could read between the lines. He would have understood. I did not tell him because by the summer of 2011, the marriage was already a polite arrangement we were both maintaining out of habit, and I did not have the energy to translate the morning into a sentence I could hand him over the kitchen counter. He noticed the day. He noticed the silence. He did not ask. We had stopped asking each other questions years before. We were just polite roommates with 2 sets of luggage. The divorce papers were already drafted in my desk drawer at work. I had been waiting until after the operation to file. I filed them on the Monday after. Christmas dinner in Annapolis, December of 2013. I was 38 years old, a freshly pinned commander. I wore civilian clothes to the dinner because I had learned by then that the uniform invited the joke faster than civilian clothes did. My father, 65, asked me what I was doing at the Pentagon now. I told him I ran a small directorate. He nodded. He said, "Still pushing paper." Tobias, 35 years old and weeks from making chief, looked at the table. My mother refilled the gravy boat. I ate my dinner and helped with the dishes and drove back to Arlington that night and sat in my car in the apartment garage for 45 minutes before I could make myself go upstairs. I stood at my kitchen window at 2 a.m, holding a cup of tea I would not drink, looking at the Christmas tree I had not bothered to take down from the year before, and I made myself a promise. I told myself I would stop explaining. I told myself I would stop seeking the word my father would not say. The work, from that night forward, would have to be enough on its own. I did not yet know how long enough on its own actually takes. It was a Tuesday evening in February of 2026. The reception at the British Embassy began at 7 o'clock. I was 51 years old. I was the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the first woman to hold the position, confirmed by the Senate in October of the previous year. I had a security detail downstairs in the lobby and a sedan in the porte cochere, and I was standing in front of the mirror at the Willard Hotel in a long navy blue gown, hair pinned back, no visible jewelry beyond my grandmother's pearl earrings, trying to remember why I had thought it was a good idea to invite my brother. I had thought it was a good idea because I was 51, and Tobias was 48, and our father had been dead for almost 8 years. and I had spent 30 years writing my brother off without admitting that I had written my brother off, and I had decided, sometime in the middle of January, that if I did not at least try to bring him into a room where he could see what my work actually looked like, I was going to spend the rest of my life pretending he had decided not to look. I had told myself in front of that same mirror 3 weeks earlier that this was the year I stopped pretending. So I had called him. I had told him I was speaking at the 75th anniversary reception for UK-US Naval Special Warfare Cooperation. I had told him he could be my +1. He had laughed on the phone. He had said the word sure in a voice that meant fine. And he had flown up for the fleet conference at the Washington Navy Yard the same week. He knocked on my hotel room door at 6:15 in a dark suit and a tie that was knotted slightly too loose. He looked me up and down and said, "Big night for the diplomat circuit, huh?" I smiled thinly and told him we should call the car. In the back of the black sedan on Massachusetts Avenue, he looked out the window at Embassy Row and said, "It's still wild to me that they pay you to go to parties." I did not answer. He laughed a little to himself and said, "Playing dress up. I have to tell Mom about this one." I put my phone in my clutch and looked straight ahead and did not respond. The driver pulled up to the British Embassy at 6:53. The wrought iron gates were already open. The principal entrance was lit by warm sconces, and a small honor delegation in dress whites was flanking the brass-handled doors. I stepped out of the sedan. Tobias followed. The 2 Navy SEALs at the doors were from Naval Special Warfare Group 2. The one on the left of the entrance was Petty Officer First Class Trent Holloway. He was 28. The one on the right was Petty Officer Second Class Garrett Brennan. He was 26. They were not on duty in the operational sense. They were on detail in the ceremonial sense. They had been given the principal entrance and a guest list briefing that did not include the full senior flag roster, and they had been told that any spouse who walked up the steps without a credential should be politely redirected to the side entrance. They were good sailors. They had not been briefed all the way down to my photograph. They saw a 51-year-old woman in a long navy gown walking up the steps with a man in a civilian suit who was laughing softly behind her. And they made the mistake any sailor with an incomplete brief and a tight ceremonial line could make. They stepped shoulder to shoulder in the center of the entrance. They exchanged a sideways look. They smirked, the kind of smirk a young SEAL gives another young SEAL when they think they have spotted the wrong door spouse. Holloway took half a step forward. He raised his hand, palm out, and tilted his chin toward the side of the building. He said, "Wrong entrance, ma'am. Spouses through the side." I did not stop walking. I lifted the embossed invitation card and my Defense Intelligence Agency identification badge from my clutch and held them up at chest height. Brennan stepped closer. He kept the same smirk on his face. He shook his head slightly. He said, "Principal entrance only. Step back." Behind me, my brother laughed. It was the same soft, sideways laugh he had been making since we were children, and it was louder than he intended. He said, half under his breath, "Even the Navy doesn't know who you are, Astor." I did not turn around. I did not lower the invitation. I did not raise my voice. I stood on the second step from the top in my navy gown and my grandmother's pearl earrings, and I waited. I did not have to wait long. A second sedan had pulled up to the curb behind ours. Rear Admiral Lower Half Ellis Quinn, 50 years old, the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Group 2, in service dress blues, with the single silver star of an 07 gleaming on each shoulder board, stepped out of the back. He had been briefed on the full guest list. He was scheduled to deliver the American welcome remarks at 7:30. He walked up the embassy steps behind me, saw the woman in the long navy gown standing on the second step from the top with her invitation lifted, saw his 2 SEALs side by side with their hands half raised, and stopped mid-stride. He looked at Holloway. He looked at Brennan. He looked at me. He recognized me before he finished blinking. He snapped to attention. He brought his right hand up to the brim of his combination cover in a parade ground salute, and he held it. He said, "Vice Admiral Lansing, ma'am." The 2 SEALs went white at the same moment. Holloway's hand fell from his belt. Brennan took a half step back from the door. My brother's laugh died in his throat as if a switch had been thrown. The doorman from the embassy staff inside the foyer heard the salute, crossed the marble, and froze at the threshold with a clipboard in his hand. I returned the salute. I held it just long enough. I lowered my hand. I said quietly, At ease, Admiral. Carry on, sailors. I walked between the two seals into the foyer of the British Embassy of the United Kingdom in the city of Washington in the District of Columbia on a Tuesday in February of 2026, and the marble floor took my heels with a soft, clean click, and a Royal Navy Commodore crossed the room to greet me by rank and by name. The defense attaché staff closed ranks around me. A protocol officer took my brother gently by the elbow and guided him toward the cloakroom. I did not look back. I made one toast. I spoke for 90 seconds at the lectern. I was the senior American flag officer in the building. 2 hours later, on the embassy steps, waiting for the car, my brother stood 6 feet to my right and did not speak. He had been carrying the laugh he made on the steps the entire night, and he did not know what to do with it now. The car came at 9:40. We rode back to the Willard in silence. Tobias got out at the lobby. He said, "Get some sleep, Astor." I said, "You too." He did not look at me. I did not look at him. I went up to my room. I hung the gown on the closet door. I sat on the edge of the bed in a hotel robe with my hair still pinned back, and I stared at the wall for a long time. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. I felt the way you feel when a sentence you have been waiting 30 years to hear someone say is finally said. And the person who said it is not the person you wanted to hear it from. The Admiral had given me what my brother had withheld. The Admiral did not know he was the substitute. He was just doing his job. The substitute does not know they are the substitute, which is what makes them the substitute. I drove back to my apartment in Arlington the next morning at 7. I took a shower. I put on my service dress blues with 3 silver stars on each shoulder board. I drove to Joint Base Anacostia Bowling. My executive officer, a Marine Lieutenant Colonel named Pierce, who had served with me on a joint task force in 2016, brought me a cup of coffee at 0700 hours and a folder of overnight cables. He did not ask about the embassy. He had known me long enough to know that if I wanted to talk about the embassy, I would have brought it up myself. I reviewed the morning's intelligence summary. I approved 3 travel orders. I signed a memorandum to the Secretary of Defense. I took a phone call from the Director of National Intelligence at 0915 hours about a partner nation request that would not be settled that day. I did the work. I did not mention the reception. The work was the easiest part. It always had been. The work was the part I knew how to do. The work was the part that had a rubric. You read the cable. You assess the source. You weigh the picture. You brief the principal. You do not invent things. You do not exaggerate. You do not pretend the room is bigger than it is. The work was the only place in my life where the rules had been written down by someone other than my father, and I had read those rules carefully in the green notebook at Dam Neck, and I had been following them for 29 years. On Saturday morning, I met Captain Iris Kowalski at a coffee shop on King Street in Old Town Alexandria. Iris had been my classmate at Bancroft Hall from 1993 to 1997. She had been the woman 2 doors down the hallway when our doors had still said, "Midshipman." She was 49. She was an 06 serving at the office of the Chief of Naval Operations. She was the closest friend I had in the world, and she was the only person I had told about the embassy by Saturday morning, because the only person you can tell about your brother is the person who has known you longer than your brother has known himself. I told her the whole story in 3 minutes. I told her about the cab and the laugh and the steps and the salute. I told her about the way my brother stood on the embassy steps 2 hours later and did not speak. Iris listened without interrupting. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she set her coffee down. She looked at me. She said, "Astrid, why did you invite him?" I did not have an answer for 9 minutes. Iris did not push. She drank her coffee. She watched the people walking past the window on King Street. She let the silence sit. Finally, I said, "Because I am still 17 years old in a kitchen in Annapolis, holding an acceptance letter, waiting for my father to read it and say something other than what he said." Iris nodded. She said, "Astrid." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. She said, "Your father is dead." I said, "I know." She said, "Tobias is not your father." I said, "I know." She said, "Then why did you invite your father to a reception? Your father has been dead for 8 years." I did not answer that one. I did not have to. That night, In my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table and opened a file on my tablet that I had not opened in 6 years. It was a scanned letter, 4 pages of yellow legal paper in my father's handwriting, dated October of 2018, the month before he died. He had written it from a hospital bed in Annapolis, with a pen my mother had brought him from the gift shop. He had written it to Tobias, not to me. The first 3 pages were about Tobias's career, about Tobias making chief, about what my father wanted Tobias to do at the rate of chief, and what kind of sailor my father wanted Tobias to be, and which kinds of chiefs my father had served under, and which had set good examples and which had not. It was a beautiful letter. It was the kind of letter a senior chief writes when he knows he is dying and he wants to leave his son a road map. I read it the first time at the funeral, and I had not opened it since. I had not opened it since because of the postscript on the last page. The postscript was 1 sentence. The sentence was in my father's handwriting, in the same blue ink, at the very bottom of the 4th page. It said, "Tell your sister I'm proud." He could write it, he could not say it. And he wrote it to my brother, not to me. I closed the tablet. I sat at the table for a long time. I did not cry. I did not feel angry. I felt the way you feel when you find a key in a drawer that fits a door you have not been able to open for 30 years. The door was still locked, but now I knew where the key had been. I made a decision that night. I made it without writing it down, the way you make a decision when you have already made it 3 times in your life and you are just acknowledging it for the 4th. I decided I was done eating the laugh. I decided I was done explaining. I decided that if my brother wanted to be in my life as my brother, he was going to learn to be my brother on terms that were not invented by a man who had been dead for 8 years. I would write him a letter, 1 page, blue ink, white paper, no DIA letterhead, no apology in it. I poured the cold tea down the sink. I went to bed. I wrote the letter the next Saturday at the same kitchen table. I wrote it longhand. I did not draft it on the laptop and print it out. I wanted him to see the handwriting. I wanted him to see that I had used the pen our father had given me at my commissioning, the only thing our father had ever given me to commemorate the rank he did not want me to earn. I wrote in blue ink on white stationery. I wrote 1 page. I told my brother that I had heard the same joke for 29 years. I told him I had eaten it at every family dinner, that I had carried it on every flight home, that I had carried it in my chest at every promotion ceremony he did not attend. I told him I had invited him to the embassy reception because I wanted him to see my work, not because I wanted him to have material to laugh at. I told him I would not be at Easter dinner in April if the laugh was going to be there again. I read it back. I considered for a long moment adding an apology somewhere in the middle. I almost did. I did not. I folded the page. I put it in the envelope. I addressed it to his apartment in Norfolk in my own handwriting. I put a stamp on it. I left the apartment in my running shoes and walked to the post office on King Street, and I dropped the envelope in the slot before I could change my mind. I did not photograph it. I did not text Iris about it. I went home and made dinner and watched a documentary about deep water trenches I did not particularly care about. On Tuesday evening, the phone rang. It was my mother. The letter had arrived in Norfolk. Tobias had called her. She was upset. She was not upset at Tobias. She was upset at me. She told me I had hurt my brother. She told me Tobias loved me in his way, and I did not need to be so harsh about it. I listened to her for 9 minutes without interrupting. I let her say everything she needed to say. When she finally finished, I said quietly, "Mom, he has laughed at me at every family dinner for 30 years. You sat at the table for all of them. You know I am not wrong." She did not answer for a long time. She said she would call back later. She did not call back that week. Tobias did not respond for 9 days. On the 10th day, a letter arrived at my apartment in Arlington. The envelope was from a Norfolk Navy lodge. I knew the handwriting on the front before I opened it. I sat at the kitchen table and I opened it. The letter was 4 pages of cramped, careful, enlisted sailor handwriting in a black ballpoint pen. I read it once. I set it down. I made a cup of tea. I read it again. The letter did not apologize on the first page. It did not apologize on the second page. On the 3rd page, in the middle, my brother wrote, "I have been telling myself for 30 years that you went a different way." The reception showed me that you went a harder way. I did not have the courage to see it before. I am writing it down now, so I cannot unsee it. On the 4th page, he asked if he could come to Arlington to talk. I put the letter in the kitchen drawer. I did not respond that night. I did not respond the next day. On the 3rd day, I wrote him back. I did not write 4 pages. I wrote 3 sentences. I wrote, "Come up next Saturday. The coffee here is better than Norfolk. We will talk about Dad." I mailed the response Monday morning from the same post office on King Street. I dropped it in the same slot. I walked back to the apartment in the same running shoes. I did not photograph it either. That night I stood at the kitchen window in the dark, looking at the river beyond the Arlington skyline, the long ribbons of headlights crossing the Memorial Bridge. I told myself I had not forgiven anything yet. I had only opened the door. The forgiving was its own conversation, but the door was open. That was more than I had expected from the year. He arrived on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. He had driven up from Norfolk. He was in jeans and a sweater and a navy ball cap he was holding in his hand instead of wearing. He had shaved. He looked 10 years older than he had in the cab on the way to the embassy. I poured him a cup of coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He did not speak for the first 3 minutes. He drank half the cup. He set it down. He said, "I drove up here twice. Once last week. I parked downstairs and sat in the car and went back to Norfolk without ringing the buzzer. I had to come back today. I am sorry it took 2 trips." I said, "It is okay that it took 2 trips." We talked first about our father. Not about me, not about Tobias. About Russell. We had never talked about him before, not really. We had not talked about him since the funeral, where we had stood next to each other and shaken hands with strangers and gone home in separate cars. We talked about the way our father had said the word wardroom in that voice. We talked about the photograph of the destroyer captain on the kitchen shelf. We talked about the line our father had drawn in the floor of the house, officers on one side, sailors on the other, and the way both of his children had stepped over it in different directions, and the way he had been disappointed in both of us, in his own way, for crossing it at all. Tobias said slowly, "I think Dad drew the line because someone drew it for him first, and he never thought to lift his foot." I had never heard my brother put that thought into words before. I had carried that exact sentence in my own head for 15 years. I had not known he had carried it too. It turned out we had been carrying a different version of the same man. Tobias told me, halfway through the second pot of coffee, about a conversation he had with our father in the spring of 2017 that I had never heard about. Tobias had taken our father out for a walk along the seawall in Annapolis after my captain promotion ceremony at Norfolk. Tobias had said on that walk that he thought Dad should call me and tell me he was proud. Tobias said our father had stopped walking and said, "I do not know how to say that sentence, Toby. I have never said it. I do not know how it comes out." Tobias said our father had looked out at the water for a long minute and then turned around and walked back to the car. Tobias had not pushed him. Tobias had not pushed him because Tobias was 20 years younger than our father, and he had been raised to think that pushing our father was not a thing a son did. Tobias said, in my kitchen in Arlington in February of 2026, that he had been thinking about that walk on the seawall every day since the embassy reception, and that he wished he had pushed our father then, and that he was sorry he had not. I did not say anything for a long minute. I refilled my own coffee. I told my brother that I was glad he had told me about the walk. I told him I had spent 20 years assuming that my father had not wanted to say the sentence. I had not considered, until this kitchen table, that my father had simply not known how. That was a different problem with a different shape, and it did not change what my father had done, but it changed something about the way I had been carrying it. I did not know yet what it changed. I would need a week to think about it. I told Tobias that. He nodded. He understood. By hour 3, the coffee pot was empty. I put on a second one. Tobias asked me, almost shyly, what I actually did at work. He said the sentence the way you ask a question you have been afraid to ask for 30 years, because you were afraid of what the answer might cost you. I told him what I could tell him. I told him the unclassified shape of my job. I told him I ran an agency of about 17,000 people. I told him I briefed the Secretary of Defense. I told him about Yemen in 2011, the parts I could describe, not the operation, not the targets, But the fact that a SEAL captain whose call sign I would never say out loud had shaken my hand in a secure room 6 weeks after a morning I do not say out loud, and had told me that his team had come home because of work I could not talk about in our father's living room. Tobias put his coffee cup down. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I am so sorry I called it embassy paperwork. I have been calling it that for 30 years. I do not know how I did not see it. I do." By hour 4, we were talking about our mother. I told Tobias I did not need our mother to apologize. I just needed her not to call me harsh again. Tobias said he would tell her. He said our mother had always been afraid of conflict and that this was not an excuse, only an explanation. I said I knew. We agreed to leave our mother out of the next conversation, not as a punishment, but as a relief. She would catch up at her own pace, in her own way. We could not drag her into this kitchen, and we did not need to. By hour 6, the light had moved across the kitchen and was lying on the floor in long bars. Tobias stood at the window and looked out across the river toward the Capitol dome, the same way I had looked out the night I had mailed the letter. He said quietly, "When the Admiral saluted you on those steps, I felt the floor drop out of me. I had been holding on to a story for 30 years, and the story broke in 2 seconds. I have not been able to put it back together. I do not want to put it back together. I want to throw it out." He turned from the window. He said, "I do not know how to be your brother yet. I want to learn. I am asking you to give me the time." I told him he could have the time. I told him I had nothing else to do with the rest of my life that was more important than this. I told him I was not going to make it easy for him. I told him I was also not going to make it harder than it needed to be. He nodded. He drank the last of his coffee. He stood at the doorway at 3 in the afternoon when he left. He turned to me with the navy ball cap in his hand. He raised his right hand to his temple in a slow, awkward, untrained gesture that was not a parade ground salute, but was the closest thing my brother had ever offered me in our entire lives. He held it, he lowered it, I returned it correctly. I held it, I lowered it. Neither of us said goodbye. He walked down the hallway to the elevator. I closed the door. I stood in the foyer of my own apartment for a long moment with my hand still on the knob. I had not expected to feel relieved. I had expected to feel something heavier. The lightness when it came was its own kind of weight. He did not become a different brother overnight. I did not pretend the 30 years had not happened. We started by texting, not calling, which was easier on both of us. He sent me a Navy Times article about the agency on a Wednesday morning in late February. I sent him a photograph of the Capitol Dome at 6:15 in the morning, taken through my office window, on a Thursday. He texted back, "That is some embassy paperwork. Stay warm in there, Aster." I read the text 3 times. I laughed alone at my desk on the 3rd reading. It was the first joke he had made about my career in 30 years that did not land like a hammer. I drove down to Norfolk on the first weekend in March. Tobias and his wife Meredith and their 2 children met me at a steakhouse a block from the apartment. My niece Caroline was 16. My nephew Davis was 14. Caroline had just been accepted to a STEM magnet program. Davis was on the JV swim team. I took them out to dinner. Tobias picked up the check. He had never picked up the check in front of me in his life. He did it without making a thing out of it. He laid his Navy Federal card on the receipt holder. He looked at me across the table. He did not say anything. I did not say anything. I let him pick up the check. I drove down to Annapolis for Easter Sunday in late March. The dogwoods on King George Street were starting to bloom. The Naval Academy grounds 3 blocks from my mother's house were already busy with families walking the brick paths for the spring concert. I parked behind my brother's truck. My niece Caroline came out the front door first and hugged me on the front walk for almost a full minute. She did not say anything. She just held on. Tobias stood on the porch in a button-down shirt, watching us. He nodded at me over Caroline's shoulder. I nodded back. My mother opened the door in an apron. There was no big speech. She hugged me at the doorway, longer than usual. She stepped back. She looked at me for a long time. She said, "He told me what you do, Astrid. He told me you briefed the Secretary of Defense. I did not know. I should have known. I should have asked." I looked at my mother for a long time. I said, "Mom, I know you should have. We can talk about it later. Today, let's just have dinner." We had dinner. Tobias made a toast to his sister that did not use the word embassy and did not use the word paperwork. Caroline, 16 years old, in a dress with the price tag still tucked into the sleeve, asked me across the table what an intelligence officer actually does. The whole table listened. I told her what I could. I watched my mother watch me from the head of the table. I watched my mother's face change in small, slow increments as the answer went on. The way a face changes when a person realizes, very late, that the person they are looking at has been there all along, in plain sight, and they had simply not turned their head. I met Iris again at the same coffee shop on King Street the next Saturday. I told her about Easter dinner. When I finished, Iris looked at me across the table. She said, "I have been your friend for 29 years. I have never seen your face look like this." I laughed. I told her not to be dramatic. She said she was not being dramatic. She said, "Your shoulders are not in your ears for the first time since Annapolis." I noticed. I sat with that for a moment. Then I ordered a second coffee. The first week of April, an envelope arrived from Norfolk. Inside, it was the framed photograph of my grandfather, the destroyer captain that had lived on the kitchen shelf in Annapolis since 1975. Tobias had taken it down from our mother's shelf with her permission. He had wrapped it in newspaper. He had enclosed a note. The note said, "I think this belongs in your office. He was an officer too. We forgot." I held the photograph at the kitchen counter for a long time. I unwrapped the newspaper carefully and set the photograph on the counter and looked at the face I had been looking at since I was 5 years old. The destroyer captain looked back at me 4 generations late. I brought the photograph to the office on Monday morning. I put it on the bookshelf behind my desk. I put it beside my own commissioning photograph from May of 1997 and beside the small folded American flag from Harlan Pierce's interment in Arlington National Cemetery in 2022. The grandfather I had never met looked out across my agency between my commissioning and Harlan's flag, and the office finally looked like a room I had earned. What? In early April, an envelope arrived at the agency for me, addressed in handwriting I did not recognize. Inside was a typed letter on plain white paper with a stamp on the envelope like a letter from a different century. The letter was from my niece Caroline. She was 16 years old. She asked whether I would be willing to write a recommendation for the Naval Academy summer seminar. I read the letter twice. I sat at my desk. I drafted the recommendation that afternoon for a full hour. I did not phone it in. I did not write what an admiral writes. I wrote what an aunt writes who has been waiting 30 years for a niece in her own family to ask her a single question about the Navy. I had been waiting for someone in my family to ask me a question about the Navy for 30 years. The first one came in a stamped envelope from a 16-year-old. I mailed Caroline the recommendation on a Thursday. I also mailed her a small envelope with the original sentence Harlan Pierce had given us at Dam Neck in 1997. The sentence I had written in the green notebook, copied out in my own handwriting onto a single sheet of white paper. I did not explain who Harlan was in the letter. I told her I would tell her over dinner the next time I came to Norfolk. I told her the sentence had cost me 30 years, and that if she still wanted the academy after she read it, I would write every letter she ever asked me for. I sealed the envelope. I dropped it in the slot at the King Street post office. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning, a postcard arrived at my office from Caroline. The postcard had a picture of the Norfolk waterfront on the front. On the back, in her handwriting, in a single careful sentence, she had written, "I still want the academy. Send the letters." The next weekend, I drove down to Annapolis to take my mother to a Navy chapel service at the academy. She wore a dress I had not seen her wear since my father's funeral. After the service, we walked along the seawall, the same brick path, the same yard patrol craft tied up at the basin. My mother stopped at the rail and looked out at the water. She said, "Your father loved you, Astrid. He did not know how to say it in a language you could hear. That is not the same as not loving you. But it is also not the same as loving you well." I did not answer for a long time. I leaned on the rail. I watched a yard patrol craft come in past the breakwater, the same way I had watched a yard patrol craft come in past the breakwater on Induction Day in July of 1993. I said, "I know, Mom. I have known. I am not angry anymore. I am just tired of pretending I was not." She did not argue. She did not push. She just stood at the rail beside me, She put her hand on my hand on the rail. We stood like that for a long time. We walked back to the car when the lights started to go. Tobias called me on a Wednesday evening in late April, off the cuff, to ask my opinion about a job. He had been offered a senior enlisted advisor billet at the Surface Warfare Officer School in Newport. It would mean a move from Norfolk. It would mean Meredith giving up her job at the hospital. He did not call me to brag about the offer. He did not call me to perform. He called me because he wanted my opinion. He said, on the phone, "I called because I wanted your opinion. I do not have anyone else to ask who would say the hard thing." I listened. I asked 3 questions. I told him what I thought. He said, "Okay, I am going to think about that. Thank you." He hung up. I sat in my kitchen with the phone in my hand. I noticed I was smiling. I had not smiled at a phone call from my brother in any year I could remember. The last Friday in April at 6 in the evening, I finished my last email of the week. I closed the laptop. I sat in the chair my father had said I would never earn. I looked across the desk at the photograph of my grandfather. I looked at the small folded flag. I thought, I am the 3rd Lancing Officer. 2 of us in uniform, 1 I have never met. And I am the only one any of them will ever have known by rank. I did not cry. I did not sigh. I just sat with it. Then I stood up and turned off the desk lamp. On the elevator down to the parking lot, alone in the steel cab, I caught my own reflection in the polished doors. 3 silver stars on each shoulder board. The face my father did not live to see at this rank. The face my brother had not seen clearly until February. I nodded once at the reflection, the way I would nod at any officer in the corridor. The doors opened. I walked out. It was the last Sunday in May. The Academy graduated the class of 2026 on the parade ground at the seawall. I stood in a small reserved section for distinguished alumni and senior officers in service dress blues with 3 silver stars on each shoulder board. My mother sat to my left. My brother sat to my right, with my niece Caroline on his other side. Meredith and Davis were in the row behind us. Iris was 2 rows back in her own dress blues. The midshipmen tossed their covers. The white caps spun up against the sky in long arcs. The Blue Angels' diamond formation came over the parade ground from the east. The crowd roared the same way the crowd had roared in 1997, the same way the crowd had roared every May for 121 years, the same way it would roar in May of next year and the year after that. My niece Caroline grabbed my elbow without meaning to. She said, "I want to do this in 5 years, Aunt Astrid." I put my hand over her hand on my elbow. I told her, "I know you do. I will write every recommendation you ever ask me for." I caught my brother watching us across her shoulder. His eyes were wet. He did not look away. He nodded once. I nodded once back. The Blue Angels finished their pass. After the parade, walking along the seawall, my brother fell into step beside me. My mother walked ahead with Caroline. My brother said quietly, "Dad would have lost his mind on this seawall today." I laughed. I said, "He would have stood right over there and pretended he was looking at the boats." We had a late lunch at the same Annapolis seafood restaurant where we had sat after my commissioning in May of 1997. Same dining room, same view of the harbor, the same window booth. I sat at the head of the table. I did not pay for the meal this time. Tobias paid. The toast he gave was 1 line. He raised his glass. He said, "To my sister, the 3rd Lancing Officer." My mother cried. Caroline cried. Davis was 14 and did not understand why everyone was crying. Iris clapped softly. I did not cry. I touched my glass to my brother's glass. I drank. I drove back to Arlington that evening, alone in the car, windows down on Route 50. The radio was off. I was in service dress blues. I passed the exit for the apartment I had rented in 1997, the year I was commissioned, the year my father had said, "Now we find out what kind of sailor you are." I took the exit for the Beltway instead. I drove the loop, slowly. I was in no hurry. I hung the service dress blues on the wooden hanger in the closet that night. I put the combination cover on the high shelf. I closed the closet door. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the river. I thought about my grandfather, the destroyer captain on the bookshelf in my office. I thought about Harlan Pierce, the man who had told me on day 1 what the cost would be, who had been right, who had been buried in Arlington in the summer of 2022 with a folded flag I now kept in a glass case behind my desk. I thought about my father in a hospital bed in Annapolis in October of 2018, writing the sentence on the last page of the letter, "Tell your sister I'm proud," and not knowing how to say it to me in person. I thought about my brother on the embassy steps in February. I thought about my niece Caroline tossing her cover into the sky in 5 years. If you have spent your life waiting for the people who were supposed to see you to finally see you, I want you to hear something. You don't have to earn the next rank for them. You already earned every one of them. The salute is not the prize. The work was the prize all along. I turned off the kitchen light. I walked down the hallway in my stocking feet. I did not look back. The river outside the window kept moving toward the sea, the same way it had moved when I was 5 years old in the kitchen in Annapolis, the same way it would keep moving when I was gone. The grandfather on the bookshelf behind my desk at the office kept watching the room. The work, in the morning, would be there waiting for me, the same as it had been on day one in the green notebook at Dam Neck. I stood in the dark hallway for a moment with my hand on the doorframe. I listened to the apartment. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could hear the wind outside the kitchen window. I could hear my own breathing, slow and even, for the first time in a very long time. I closed the bedroom door. If your family has spent your whole life calling your career something small, a desk job, paperwork, dress up, I want you to do one thing for me. Look around the room you're sitting in right now. Look at the chair you're in. You earned it. They don't have to see it for it to be real. I'd love to know in the comments, who in your life finally saw you for the first time? And what was the moment that opened their eyes? And if this one hit something in you, hit subscribe before you go.